This is the half-life penny lab. It can be used to model radiometric decay using 100 coins. It also can be used to introduce Google Sheets to students. The first tab on the Google Sheet that you will share with your students introduces them to Google Sheets as a spreadsheet, and it tells them about how across the top of the box are the names of the columns, A and B and C, and on the side on the left are the names of the rows, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And then it tells your students to click on the tabs at the bottom to do other things. The second tab is data collection. When students are comfortable with the A's and B's and C's and 1s and 2s and 3s, they can click on the second tab, data collection. The data collection tab asks your students to take 100 coins and flip them, imagining that each coin is a radioactive parent isotope. I've also provided links for 4 different penny flippers online that your students may have access to. The directions tell your students to place all their pennies heads up, and then to count them. There should be 100, and enter that number of pennies that are heads up into the yellow cell, which I've already done for you. Then your students will shake their pennies and toss them at once. They'll separate the heads from the tails. The tails represent atoms that have changed, in other words, daughter atoms or stable isotopes. We don't need those pennies again, and they'll not be entered into the experiment again. We're going to count the number of pennies that are still heads up, and we're going to enter our data into the cell F24, in this case, the orange cell. Perhaps your students will get 52 heads up pennies at that point. Then they're going to toss the heads up pennies and again separate the heads up from the tails up. The tails up pennies are stable and they will no longer be counted. The heads up pennies at this point, perhaps there are 23 of them. You'll continue doing this with your students until they reach 0 pennies heads up. So I'll just enter in some pretend data as if I had done this activity. Once they reach 0, and you'll click on the graph of my data, and you'll see that this Google Sheet will create a graph for them. The first analysis question says, do you think you would get exactly the same results if you did the experiment a second time? Why or why not? At this point, you can talk about sample size. After they've finished answering the analysis question, they're going to click on the Mathematically Calculated tab below. On the Mathematically Calculated tab, there is an explanation of what radioactivity means and how parent atoms change to daughter atoms. For the purpose of our experiment, we're going to call one run, or the first run, the half-life of the heads-up pennies. So we're going to toss our coins and we're going to record our data, but in this case, we're going to do the process mathematically. Instead of tossing pennies, we're going to just put down what you'd expect to have happen for each penny toss. We're going to call this the mathematically calculated numbers of pennies that are heads up and heads down and tails up. So if you start with 100 pennies, mathematically you would expect 50 would be heads up and 50 would be tails up. And if you toss 50 pennies, you'd expect 25, and so on. And students will probably need to use a calculator at some point, but you can just enter in your data until you get to whatever number you've decided. When you click on the graph the math data, you'll notice that the individual data and the math data have both been graphed on the same graph. So students can see how close their individual data came to what we would expect mathematically. There are 3 more analysis questions to go along with this graph. Why do you think your results are not exactly what you'd expect mathematically? Would you be more or less close to the mathematically expected graph if you had more pennies or fewer pennies? And then when you're done, you're going to move on to the Group Data tab. The Group Data tab asks students to copy and paste their data into this green column, and then it provides 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 fictional students' data. What we'll do is we'll average the 7 students' data plus your own individual data together to get a group data to see what would happen if you did have 700 pennies rather than 100 pennies. So we'll copy our data from our individual data tab, and we'll enter it into the group tab. And you'll see that it did change the group data averages. The analysis question asks, why didn't every team get the exact same results? When you move on to the Graph of Everything tab, it shows all three lines, and it's pretty hard to see on here unless you make it much, much, much bigger. But it has the individual data tab, it has the mathematically calculated tab, and it has the group data. And the intention, of course, is that your individual data is much farther away from the group data or the mathematically calculated data, and that the group data with a larger sample size would be more similar to the mathematically collected data. The last analysis question says, which was closer to the mathematically calculated numbers, you individually or the whole class, and why? And this is one way to show your students how to use Google Sheets and how radiometric decay occurs.